It was 3:27 a.m. when Buddy started whimpering. The sound wasn't loud, but it echoed through Dr. Sarah Collins' sparse apartment like a siren. Sarah stirred in her sleep, her subconscious registering the noise before her conscious mind. When Buddy's whimpers turned to anxious pacing around her bed, she finally opened her eyes. "What is it, boy?" she mumbled, reaching out to pet the golden retriever's head. Instead of leaning into her touch as he usually did, Buddy backed away, his tail tucked between his legs. His amber eyes, usually so gentle and calm, were wide with what Sarah could only describe as fear. Sarah sat up, instantly more alert. In the 2 months since she'd rescued Buddy from the side of the road, she'd never seen him act this way. "Hey, it's okay." She tried again, her voice softer now. But Buddy just paced more frantically, occasionally stopping to look at her, as if trying to communicate something urgent. A faint tremor ran through the apartment, so subtle that Sarah might have missed it if she hadn't spent the last 5 years studying seismic activity. The lamp on her bedside table rattled slightly, and the water in the glass next to it rippled. It was nothing, a tiny aftershock, the kind that happened dozens of times a day in San Francisco. But Buddy's reaction seemed disproportionate. Sarah swung her legs over the edge of the bed and reached for her phone. No alerts from the USGS, nothing unusual, just another small tremor in a city built on fault lines. "It's okay, Buddy," she said again, more firmly this time. "Just a little shake, nothing to worry about." But Buddy wasn't convinced. He continued his anxious pacing, occasionally stopping to look back at her with those worried eyes, as if wondering why she wasn't more concerned. Sarah let out a sigh and glanced at the clock. 3:32 a.m. Too early to be up, but she knew from experience that once she was awake, falling back asleep would be nearly impossible, especially with Buddy acting so strangely. "Fine," she muttered, standing up and reaching for her robe. "Let's get some water, and then we're going back to sleep." As she made her way to the kitchen, Buddy following closely at her heels, Sarah couldn't help but think about the data she'd been analyzing at the lab. Small tremors had been increasing over the past few weeks. Nothing alarming, but enough to make her team pay closer attention. Tomorrow, she was supposed to present her findings to the department head. Her stomach knotted at the thought. 2 years after the big one had devastated parts of Northern California, seismologists were under more pressure than ever to improve prediction methods. The memory of that day flashed unbidden into Sarah's mind, the violent shaking that had thrown her to the ground, the sound of glass shattering, the way the world had seemed to shift beneath her feet, and then the aftermath, the collapsed buildings, the fires, the desperate search for survivors. The day she'd lost everything. Sarah shook her head, trying to dispel the images. She filled a glass with water and took a long drink, the cool liquid helping to ground her in the present. When she looked down, Buddy was sitting at her feet, his anxious energy momentarily subdued. But his eyes still held that same worried look. "What's gotten into you tonight?" she murmured, crouching down to his level. She ran her hands over his golden fur, checking for any signs of injury or distress. Nothing seemed physically wrong. Buddy leaned into her touch now, some of the tension leaving his body. But just as Sarah was about to stand up, another tremor rippled through the apartment, stronger this time. The cabinets rattled, and a mug that had been sitting too close to the edge of the counter crashed to the floor, shattering into pieces. Sarah instinctively reached for Buddy, pulling him close as the tremor continued for several seconds longer than the previous one. When it finally subsided, she realized she was holding her breath. Her phone buzzed in the pocket of her robe. A USGS alert magnitude 3.7, centered about 15 miles from the city. Noticeable but not dangerous. Still, something didn't feel right. Buddy had started whimpering well before the first tremor had hit, and his reaction had been immediate, almost as if he'd sensed it coming. Sarah's scientific mind immediately began working through possibilities. Animals were known to be sensitive to environmental changes. There were countless anecdotal reports of pets behaving strangely before earthquakes. But the scientific community remained divided on whether animals could truly predict seismic events, or if they were simply reacting to the initial primary waves that humans couldn't feel. She looked at Buddy again, who had calmed somewhat but still seemed on edge. Then she made a decision. "Come on, boy," she said, standing up and heading back to her bedroom. "We're going to the lab." 20 minutes later, Sarah was driving through the nearly empty streets of San Francisco, Buddy sitting anxiously in the passenger seat beside her. The city was beautiful at night, its iconic hills adorned with twinkling lights, the Bay Bridge illuminated against the dark water. But Sarah barely noticed the scenery, her mind racing with questions and possibilities. If Buddy had somehow sensed the earthquake before it happened, what did that mean? Could it be coincidence? Or was there something more significant at play? The Berkeley Seismological Laboratory was quiet when they arrived, which wasn't surprising given the hour. Sarah used her keycard to enter the building, Buddy trotting obediently at her side. Technically, dogs weren't allowed in the lab, but at 4:15 in the morning, Sarah figured no one would be around to complain. Her office was small but functional, with a desk cluttered with papers and research journals, a whiteboard covered in equations and notes, and a window overlooking the campus. But Sarah bypassed her office and headed straight for the main lab, where the seismographs and monitoring equipment were housed. "Sit," she told Buddy, pointing to a spot near her workstation. The golden retriever obeyed, but his eyes continued to dart around nervously. Sarah pulled up the latest seismic data on her computer. The 3.7 quake showed up clearly, as did the smaller tremor that had preceded it. But what interested her more was the pattern of tremors that had been occurring over the past week. They formed a clear progression along the Hayward Fault, as if something was building. "Jujere, Collins." Sarah jumped at the voice, turning to find Dr. Marcus Chen standing in the doorway. Marcus was a fellow seismologist and the deputy director of the lab. His presence at this hour was unexpected. "Marcus," she said, trying to sound casual. "What are you doing here so early?" "I could ask you the same thing," he replied, his eyes moving to Buddy. "And since when do we allow dogs in the lab?" Sarah felt a flush of embarrassment. "I'm sorry about that. He was acting strange right before the tremors tonight, and I thought." She trailed off, suddenly aware of how unscientific her reasoning might sound. But to her surprise, Marcus's expression softened. "Actually, I've been reading some interesting research on animal behavior and seismic activity. There might be something to it." He walked further into the lab and crouched down to Buddy's level, offering his hand for the dog to sniff. "What's his name?" "Buddy," Sarah replied, relieved that Marcus wasn't upset about the dog's presence. "I found him about 2 months ago. He was injured on the side of the road, so I took him to a vet and ended up keeping him." Marcus nodded, still focused on Buddy. "And you said he was acting strange before the tremors. How long before?" "That's what's interesting," Sarah said, turning back to her computer to check the timing. "The first tremor hit at 3:29 a.m., followed by the 3.7 at 3:41 a.m. But Buddy started acting anxious at 3:27 a.m. That's 2 full minutes before the first detectable tremor." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "That could be significant. Or it could be coincidence," Sarah cautioned, always the scientist. "One data point isn't enough to draw conclusions." "True," Marcus agreed, standing up. "But it's worth investigating further." A thought occurred to Sarah. What if we set up a camera to monitor Buddy's behavior alongside our seismic data? If he consistently shows signs of distress before detectable seismic activity, it could give us more data points. Marcus considered this for a moment. "It's unorthodox, but I'm open to it. Let's discuss it with the team during the morning meeting." He glanced at his watch. "Which is in about 3 hours. You might want to go home and get some rest before then." Sarah nodded, but her mind was already racing with possibilities. If Buddy could sense earthquakes before they happened, it could have implications for early warning systems. Even a few extra seconds of warning could save lives. "I think I'll stay," she said. "I want to review the data from the past week again, especially in light of tonight's events." Marcus gave her a knowing look. "Just don't push yourself too hard, Sarah. I know these anniversary months are difficult." Sarah stiffened slightly. She didn't like to talk about the earthquake that had claimed her husband and daughter 2 years ago. The pain was still too raw, the guilt too overwhelming. If she had been home that day instead of at the lab, could she have saved them? It was a question that haunted her dreams. "I'm fine," she said, perhaps too quickly. "I just want to be thorough with my research." Marcus didn't press the issue. "All right, I'll see you at the meeting." And, he added, glancing at Buddy, "I'll make an exception for your furry friend, but let's keep him out of sight during normal business hours." After Marcus left, Sarah turned her attention back to the data. But her mind kept drifting to Buddy's strange behavior. Could he really sense earthquakes before they happened? And if so, how? She pulled up an internet browser and searched for studies on animal behavior and earthquake prediction. There were numerous anecdotal reports from around the world: dogs howling before major earthquakes, birds abandoning their nests, snakes emerging from hibernation. In China, there were even stories of zoo animals becoming agitated hours before a major earthquake struck. but hard scientific evidence was scarce. Most of the research was observational rather than experimental, making it difficult to establish causation. Sarah glanced at Buddy, who had fallen asleep at her feet, his earlier anxiety apparently forgotten. It was easy to dismiss animal behavior as superstition or coincidence. But what if there was something more to it? What if animals could sense subtle changes in the environment? Changes that even the most sophisticated instruments couldn't detect. The idea was both exciting and unnerving. As a scientist, Sarah was trained to be skeptical, to demand evidence and replication. But she was also taught to observe patterns and formulate hypotheses. She opened a new document on her computer and began typing Project Buddy, investigating the potential for canine detection of seismic activity. It was a starting point. And perhaps, she thought with a glimmer of hope that surprised her, it could lead to something meaningful, something that could save lives. As the first light of dawn filtered through the lab windows, Sarah finally closed her computer. She had compiled a preliminary research plan that she would present at the morning meeting. It was unconventional, and she expected some resistance. But the potential benefits were too significant to ignore. "Come on, Buddy," she said, gently nudging the sleeping dog. "Time to go home and get ready for the day." Buddy lifted his head, his amber eyes meeting hers. And in that moment, Sarah felt a connection with the dog that went beyond mere companionship. They were partners now, embarking on a scientific journey together. Little did she know that this journey would lead her to discoveries far beyond what she could imagine, and that Buddy's unusual sensitivity would soon be put to the ultimate test. The morning meeting went better than Sarah had anticipated. While there was some skepticism about her proposed Project Buddy, the recent increase in seismic activity along the Hayward Fault had everyone's attention. Any potential early warning system, no matter how unconventional, was worth exploring. "I'm not saying we should base our entire earthquake prediction model on dog behavior," Sarah clarified to the team of 8 seismologists and geophysicists gathered around the conference table. "But if Buddy consistently shows signs of distress before detectable seismic activity, it could give us insights into precursors that our instruments might be missing." Dr. Lisa Hernandez, the lab's lead geophysicist, looked unconvinced. "While I appreciate your innovative thinking, Dr. Collins, I'm concerned about the lack of scientific rigor. How do we control for false positives? Dogs can become anxious for many reasons." It was a valid point, and one that Sarah had considered. "That's why I'm proposing a structured observation protocol," she explained. "We'll monitor Buddy 24/7 with cameras, tracking his behavior alongside our seismic data. We'll also record environmental factors like temperature, barometric pressure, and electromagnetic fields that might influence his behavior." Marcus, who had been quiet so far, spoke up. "I think it's worth a try. We've hit a wall with traditional prediction methods. Maybe it's time to think outside the box." Dr. James Wilson, the department head, leaned forward in his chair. "I'm willing to allocate a small budget for this project, but I want clear metrics for success and regular progress reports. And," he added, looking directly at Sarah, "this can't interfere with your primary research duties." Sarah nodded, feeling a rush of excitement. It wasn't a full endorsement, but it was enough to get started. "Thank you. I'll have a detailed protocol ready by tomorrow." As the meeting shifted to other topics, Sarah's mind was already racing with plans. She would need to set up monitoring equipment at her apartment, create a behavioral analysis framework, and consult with veterinarians and animal behaviorists. But first, she needed to talk to someone who knew more about dogs than she did. After the meeting, Sarah made her way across campus to the university's veterinary sciences building. She had called ahead and secured a meeting with Dr. Maya Rodriguez, a veterinarian who specialized in animal behavior. Dr. Rodriguez's office was warm and inviting, with plants on the windowsill and photos of various animals covering the walls. The veterinarian herself was a petite woman with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail and kind eyes that crinkled when she smiled. "So," Dr. Rodriguez said after Sarah had explained her project, "you think your dog can predict earthquakes?" Put that way, it sounded almost silly. "I don't know," Sarah admitted. "That's what I'm trying to find out. Last night, he showed signs of distress several minutes before any detectable seismic activity. It could have been coincidence, but what if it wasn't?" Dr. Rodriguez nodded thoughtfully. "It's not as far-fetched as it might sound. Dogs have sensory abilities that far exceed our own. Their hearing is more acute, and they can detect odors at concentrations up to 100,000 times lower than what humans can smell. It's possible they're picking up on something we're missing." This was exactly the kind of insight Sarah had hoped for. What might they be sensing before an earthquake? Changes in the air, ground vibrations too subtle for humans. All of those are possibilities, Dr. Rodriguez said. There are also theories about animals sensing changes in the Earth's magnetic field, or detecting the release of gases from the ground before a quake. The challenge has always been designing a study that can isolate these variables. Sarah leaned forward, excited by the possibilities. That's where my research comes in. I have access to sophisticated monitoring equipment that can measure seismic activity, electromagnetic fields, and atmospheric conditions. If I can correlate those measurements with Buddy's behavior, I might be able to identify what he's responding to. Dr. Rodriguez smiled. It sounds like you've given this some thought, but I have to ask, what's driving this research? Is it purely scientific curiosity, or is there something more? The question caught Sarah off guard. What was driving her? Scientific curiosity, yes, but also something deeper, more personal. The memory of that day 2 years ago, the helplessness she had felt, the lives lost that might have been saved with just a few minutes' warning. I'm a seismologist, she said finally. Earthquake prediction is my field. But yes, there's something more. 2 years ago, I lost my husband and daughter in an earthquake. If we had it even a few minutes' warning. She trailed off, unable to complete the thought. Dr. Rodriguez's expression softened with understanding. I'm sorry for your loss, and I can see why this research would be particularly meaningful to you. Sarah nodded, not trusting herself to speak. I'd be happy to help with your project. Dr. Rodriguez continued. I can provide guidance on canine behavior analysis and help you develop a protocol for monitoring Buddy's reactions. And if you're open to it, I'd like to introduce you to some colleagues who might be interested in collaborating. By the time Sarah left Dr. Rodriguez's office an hour later, she had a notebook full of ideas and a list of contacts. The project was beginning to take shape, and for the first time in a long time, Sarah felt a sense of purpose that went beyond her day-to-day research. As she walked back to her car, where Buddy was waiting patiently, she felt a lightness in her step that had been absent for too long. Whether or not Buddy could actually predict earthquakes, this project had given her something she hadn't realized she needed: hope. It had been 3 weeks since Project Buddy had officially begun, and Sarah was immersed in a whirlwind of activity. Her apartment had been transformed into a monitoring station, with cameras in every room tracking Buddy's movements and behavior. Sensors measured electromagnetic fields, air quality, and ground vibrations, all feeding data into a computer system that Sarah had designed with the help of the university's engineering department. The project had attracted attention beyond what Sarah had anticipated. Several of her colleagues had volunteered to help analyze data, and a graduate student had been assigned to assist with the behavioral analysis. Dr. Rodriguez had introduced her to researchers from other universities who were studying animal behavior and natural disasters, forming a small but dedicated interdisciplinary team. Buddy, for his part, seemed unfazed by the attention. He went about his days as usual, sleeping, playing, and accompanying Sarah on walks around the neighborhood. The only unusual behavior came in the form of periodic episodes of anxiety, pacing, whining, and seeking Sarah's proximity, which sometimes, but not always, preceded small tremors. Sarah was in the lab, reviewing the latest data with Marcus, when her phone buzzed with a text message from Jake, her ex-boyfriend and the city's emergency management director. They had dated briefly before the earthquake that claimed her family, but the tragedy had driven a wedge between them. Sarah had pushed everyone away in her grief, including Jake. Heard about your doggy earthquake detector. City Hall is interested. Can we talk? Sarah showed the message to Marcus, who raised an eyebrow. City Hall, that's a big deal. It's premature, Sarah said, feeling a flutter of anxiety. We don't have enough data yet to make any claims. We're still in the exploratory phase. Marcus gave her a knowing look. But if your research pans out, it could have significant practical applications. The city's emergency management team would be a natural partner. Sarah knew he was right, but the thought of discussing her project with Jake made her uneasy. They hadn't spoken in over a year, not since that disastrous dinner when he had suggested, gently but firmly, that she needed to find a way to move forward. She hadn't been ready to hear it then. Was she ready now? After a moment's hesitation, she texted back, still early stages but happy to discuss. Tomorrow, 2 p.m. at my lab. Jake's response came almost immediately, see you then. That night, as Sarah reviewed the data collected so far, she couldn't help but feel a mixture of excitement and trepidation. The evidence was still anecdotal, but there was a pattern emerging. In the past 3 weeks, Buddy had shown signs of distress before 6 of the 8 minor tremors that had occurred. The 2 he had missed were the smallest, barely registering on the seismographs. More intriguingly, the time between Buddy's reaction and the actual tremor seemed to correlate with the magnitude of the event. The stronger the earthquake, the earlier Buddy seemed to sense it, ranging from 2 minutes for the smallest detectable tremors to nearly 15 minutes for a magnitude 3.2 earthquake that had occurred the previous week. If this pattern held for larger events, it could potentially provide valuable warning time. But Sarah was cautious. The sample size was still small, and there were many variables they hadn't controlled for. What if Buddy was reacting to something else entirely? What if his behavior was influenced by her own stress levels or subtle environmental changes unrelated to seismic activity? She was still pondering these questions when Buddy, who had been sleeping peacefully at her feet, suddenly sat up, his ears perked forward, and he let out a low whine. Sarah checked the time, 11:42 p.m. She immediately began recording observations in the log they had established. 11:42 p.m. Buddy shows initial signs of alertness. Ears forward, body tense. 11:43 p.m. Whining becomes more insistent. Pacing begins. 11:45 p.m. Seeking proximity, pressing against my legs. Sarah reached down to comfort Buddy, but her mind was racing. Based on previous patterns, if this was indeed a reaction to an impending tremor, they could expect seismic activity within the next 15 minutes, with a magnitude potentially above 3.0. She sent a quick text to Marcus, who was on call that night. Buddy alert, logging behavior now. Stand by for potential seismic event. Then she waited, watching as Buddy's anxiety escalated. He was now pacing frantically, occasionally stopping to look at her with those worried amber eyes, as if imploring her to understand the danger. At 11:52 p.m., exactly 10 minutes after Buddy's initial reaction, the first tremor hit. Sarah felt the familiar slight swaying motion, heard the soft rattle of objects on shelves. It lasted only a few seconds, a minor event by most standards. But Buddy wasn't calming down. If anything, his behavior was becoming more agitated. He ran to the door, then back to Sarah, then to the door again, barking now, something he rarely did. Sarah's phone rang. It was Marcus. "Did you feel that?" he asked without preamble. "Yes, small tremor, as expected based on Buddy's behavior, but he's still agitated." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Our instruments are showing elevated activity along the fault. Could be aftershocks, but..." Marcus didn't need to finish the sentence. They both knew what elevated activity could mean. "I'm coming to the lab," Sarah said decisively. "And I'm bringing Buddy." The drive to the lab was tense. Buddy sat in the passenger seat, still clearly distressed. His whining had subsided, but his body remained rigid, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. The lab was buzzing with activity when they arrived, despite the late hour. Several team members had come in after feeling the tremor, and the monitoring stations were fully manned. "What's the status?" Sarah asked, making her way to Marcus, who was studying a series of readouts with a furrowed brow. "We've had 6 small tremors in the past hour, all clustered along this section of the fault," he said, pointing to a map display. "It's unusual." Sarah looked at the pattern of dots on the map, each representing a seismic event. They formed a clear progression, moving northwest along the fault line. "It looks like stress migration," she said, the implications settling in her stomach like a stone. Marcus nodded grimly. "That's what I'm afraid of. If the stress continues to build and migrate." He didn't need to finish the thought. They both knew what it could mean. A significant earthquake was potentially in the making. Sarah glanced at Buddy, who had settled somewhat but was still on high alert. "How long do you think we have?" Marcus shook his head. "Hard to say. Could be hours, could be days. Or it could dissipate entirely." But Sarah had a feeling it wouldn't dissipate. Something about Buddy's continued anxiety suggested that what they were witnessing was just the beginning. "We need to notify the city's emergency management," she said, making a decision. "If there's even a chance of a significant event, they need to be prepared." Marcus hesitated. "Are you sure? False alarms have consequences. If we alert the city and nothing happens, and if we don't alert them and something does happen," Sarah countered. "I'd rather explain a false alarm than live with the alternative." After a moment, Marcus nodded. "You're right, make the call." Sarah took a deep breath and reached for her phone. It was time to call Jake. Jake Matthews was at the Emergency Management Center within an hour of Sarah's call. He arrived looking sharp despite the late hour, his dark hair slightly tousled, his eyes alert and focused. Sarah felt a flutter of something in her chest when she saw him, a mixture of old feelings and new anxiety. "Sarah." He greeted her with a nod, his expression professional but warm. "It's been a while. Thanks for coming so quickly," she replied, equally professional. "This is Dr. Marcus Chen, Deputy Director of the Berkeley Seismological Laboratory." Jake shook Marcus's hand, then turned his attention to Buddy, who was sitting quietly next to Sarah's chair. "And this must be the famous Buddy." To Sarah's surprise, Jake crouched down to Buddy's level, offering his hand for the dog to sniff. Buddy, after a moment's hesitation, licked Jake's fingers, his tail wagging slightly. "He likes you," Sarah observed, a small smile tugging at her lips despite the gravity of the situation. Jake returned the smile. "Dogs are good judges of character." Then, standing up, he became all business again. "Tell me what we're looking at." For the next half hour, Sarah and Marcus briefed Jake on the seismic data, the pattern of tremors, and the implications. They explained Buddy's behavior and how it had consistently preceded seismic events over the past 3 weeks. Jake listened attentively, asking occasional questions that revealed his solid understanding of earthquake science. Sarah remembered that he had taken geology courses in college before switching to emergency management. So based on this data, Jake summarized when they had finished, "You believe there's a significant probability of a major earthquake in the coming hours or days?" Sarah nodded, aware of the weight of her words. "The pattern of stress migration along the fault is concerning, and Buddy's continued anxiety suggests that what we've seen so far is just a prelude." Jake was silent for a moment, his expression thoughtful. Then he turned to Marcus. "What's your assessment, Dr. Chen?" Marcus straightened in his chair. "The data indicates an unusual pattern of activity. While I can't say with certainty that a major event is imminent, the risk is elevated enough to warrant precautionary measures." Jake nodded, then took out his phone. "I'm going to initiate a level 2 alert. That means we notify all emergency services to be on standby, check critical infrastructure, and prepare for potential evacuation of vulnerable areas. But we don't alert the public yet, not until we have more concrete information." Sarah felt a rush of relief. Jake was taking them seriously, despite the unconventional nature of their warning. "Thank you," she said quietly. Jake met her eyes. "Don't thank me yet. If this turns out to be a false alarm, there will be questions. And if it isn't..." He didn't need to finish the thought. "We understand the risks," Sarah assured him. "But we couldn't stay silent, not with what we're seeing." Jake nodded, then made a series of quick calls, setting the emergency protocol in motion. When he was done, he turned back to Sarah and Marcus. "I'd like to stay here, if that's all right. I want to be here if the situation develops further." And so began a tense night of waiting and watching. The seismology team continued to monitor the fault line activity, while Jake coordinated with emergency services from the lab. Sarah divided her attention between the seismic data and Buddy, whose behavior she documented meticulously. As dawn approached, the tension in the lab was palpable. The tremors had continued throughout the night, small but persistent, like warning shots. Buddy remained anxious, though his behavior had stabilized somewhat, less frantic pacing, more quiet vigilance. Sarah was at her computer, analyzing the latest data, when Jake approached with 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to her and took a seat in the empty chair beside her. "Thanks," she said, grateful for the caffeine. She hadn't slept in over 24 hours, and fatigue was beginning to cloud her thinking. "How are you holding up?" Jake asked, his voice gentle. Sarah took a sip of coffee before answering. "I'm fine. Just focused on the data." Jake was quiet for a moment, studying her. "You know, in all this time, we've never really talked about what happened." Sarah stiffened. "This isn't the time, Jake." "When is the time, Sarah?" he asked, his voice still gentle but insistent. "You've been running from it for 2 years. You've thrown yourself into your work, isolated yourself from friends, from me." The words stung because they were true. After losing David and Emma, Sarah had retreated into herself, building walls around her grief, refusing to let anyone in, including Jake, who had only wanted to help. "I couldn't," she began, then stopped, unsure of what she wanted to say. "I couldn't face the pain. I couldn't bear your compassion. I couldn't stand the thought of moving on." Jake seemed to understand her unspoken thoughts. "I know," he said softly. "I just want you to know that I never stopped caring. And seeing you now, with this project, with Buddy, it seems like you're finding your way back." Sarah looked down at Buddy, who was resting his head on her foot. The golden retriever had come into her life unexpectedly, a wounded creature she hadn't planned to keep. But in the 2 months since she'd taken him in, He had somehow begun to heal something in her that she had thought was broken beyond repair. Haze helped, she admitted, more than I expected. Jake smiled. Animals have a way of doing that. They live in the present, you know. They don't dwell on the past or worry about the future. They just are. There's something healing in that simplicity. Sarah was about to respond when Buddy suddenly lifted his head, his body tensing. A second later, he was on his feet, letting out a sharp bark that echoed through the lab. Sarah immediately checked the time, 5:47 a.m. Buddy alert, she called out, loud enough for the entire lab to hear. All stations, prepare for possible seismic activity. The team sprang into action, checking instruments, securing loose objects, bracing for what might come. Jake was on his feet too, phone in hand, ready to escalate the alert if necessary. Minutes ticked by, tension building with each passing second. Buddy's anxiety was escalating rapidly, beyond anything Sarah had documented before. He was barking continuously now, running in circles, then trying to pull Sarah toward the door. This is different, Sarah said, a cold feeling settling in her stomach. His reaction is much stronger than before. At 5:52 a.m., the first strong tremor hit. It was magnitude 4.0, enough to shake the building noticeably, to rattle windows and topple unsecured objects. But Buddy's continued frantic behavior suggested it wasn't over. Jake was already on the phone, upgrading the alert to level 3, public notification, preparation for possible evacuation. How much time do we have? He asked Sarah, covering the phone's mouthpiece. Sarah looked at Buddy, at the seismic data, at the pattern of stress migration that had been building for hours. I don't know exactly, she admitted. But based on previous patterns and the intensity of Buddy's reaction, I'd estimate within the hour, and it's going to be big, possibly magnitude 6 or higher. Jake nodded grimly and relayed the information. Then he turned to Marcus. We need to go public with this warning now. Every minute counts. Marcus hesitated only briefly before nodding his agreement. Do it. We'll take responsibility if we're wrong. Jake made another call, this time to the mayor's office. Within minutes, the emergency alert system was activated, sending notifications to every cell phone in the Bay Area. Earthquake warning, significant seismic event possible within the hour. Take precautions now. Stay tuned for further information. The next 45 minutes were a blur of activity as the lab continued to monitor the situation and coordinate with emergency services. Reports started coming in from around the city as people responded to the alert, some with preparation, others with panic. Sarah remained focused on the data, on Buddy, on the science that had brought them to this point. But a part of her couldn't help but wonder, what if they were wrong? What if this was all a false alarm, triggered by a dog's anxiety that had nothing to do with earthquakes? Then, at 6:37 a.m., exactly 50 minutes after Buddy's initial alert, it happened. The ground began to shake, gently at first, then with increasing intensity. Sarah felt the familiar sensation of the world shifting beneath her feet, but this time it was different. This time they had warning. Under the desk, she shouted, pulling Buddy with her as she took cover. Jake was beside her in an instant, his body partially shielding both her and the dog as the shaking intensified. Objects crashed to the floor around them, lights flickered, and the sound of breaking glass filled the air. The violent shaking continued for what felt like an eternity but was probably less than a minute. When it finally subsided, the lab was in disarray, but everyone appeared to be unharmed. Is everyone okay? Marcus called out, emerging from under his own desk. A chorus of affirmative responses echoed through the room. Sarah looked at Jake, who was still crouched beside her, his arm protectively around her shoulders. You good? He asked, his eyes searching her face with concern. She nodded, her heart still racing from the adrenaline. I'm okay. Then, looking down at Buddy, who was pressed against her side, trembling slightly but calm, she added, We're okay. Jake helped her to her feet, and together they surveyed the damage to the lab. Computers had been toppled, papers scattered, and several monitoring stations damaged. But the main systems were intact, powered by backup generators that had kicked in when the electricity failed. Marcus was already at the central monitoring station, assessing the earthquake's impact. Preliminary data shows it was a 6.2, he announced, his voice tense but controlled. Epicenter about 12 miles from here, along the Hayward Fault, exactly where we predicted. Sarah felt a complex mix of emotions wash over her. Validation that their warnings had been accurate, but also a deep awareness of what this meant for the city. A 6.2 magnitude earthquake was serious, capable of causing significant damage, especially to older structures. Jake was on his phone immediately, coordinating with emergency teams across the city. We need status reports from all districts, he was saying. Priority on hospitals, schools, and high-density residential areas, and get me a damage assessment on the Bay Bridge and BART tunnels. Sarah turned to her own computer, which had thankfully remained secure on its stabilized workstation. She needed to analyze the seismic data, to understand what had happened and what might still be coming. Aftershocks were inevitable, and some could be strong enough to cause additional damage. But first, she reached down to Buddy, kneeling beside him and wrapping her arms around his golden form. "You did it, boy," she whispered against his fur. "You warned us. You gave us time." Buddy responded by licking her face, his earlier anxiety replaced by a quiet steadiness that Sarah found reassuring. It was as if he knew his job was done, at least for now. "Dr. Collins." One of the junior researchers called from across the room. "You need to see this." Sarah crossed to where the young scientist was pointing at a monitor, which displayed a map of the city with overlays showing expected damage patterns. "Look at the difference," the researcher said, pulling up a split screen. On one side was a projection of expected casualties and damage without warning. On the other, the current estimates with the warning they had provided. The difference was stark. Even with less than an hour's warning, the alert had allowed emergency services to mobilize, hospitals to prepare, and many residents to take basic precautions. The projected casualty count was significantly lower than it would have been without warning. "We saved lives today," Sarah murmured, the magnitude of what they had accomplished beginning to sink in. Jake appeared at her shoulder, having overheard. "Yes, we did, and it's just the beginning." For the next several hours, the lab was a hub of frantic activity as they tracked aftershocks, updated damage assessments, and coordinated with emergency services. Reports were coming in from across the city: collapsed buildings in older neighborhoods, fires in some areas, water main breaks, and power outages. But thanks to the warning, emergency teams had been deployed rapidly, and many potentially dangerous situations had been mitigated before they could escalate. By mid-afternoon, the immediate crisis had begun to stabilize. Aftershocks continued, but none approached the magnitude of the main event, and the emergency response was well underway. It was time to take stock and plan next steps. Marcus called a meeting of the core team, including Jake, who had been working alongside them all day. They gathered in the one conference room that had escaped major damage, tired but determined. First, Marcus began. "I want to acknowledge what we accomplished today. Thanks to Dr. Collins' research and Buddy's remarkable abilities, we provided the first effective early warning for a major earthquake in U.S. history. The preliminary reports suggest we may have reduced casualties by as much as 60% compared to what could have been expected without warning." A murmur of satisfaction ran through the group. It was a significant achievement, one that validated the unconventional approach they had taken. "The question now," Marcus continued, "is where do we go from here?" This was, in many ways, a fortunate confluence of circumstances. We happened to be monitoring at the right time, with the right tools, and the right dog. He nodded toward Buddy, who was lying peacefully at Sarah's feet. "But we can't count on such fortunate timing in the future." Jake leaned forward. "The city is prepared to fund further research into animal-based early warning systems. What happened today has convinced even the skeptics that there's something to this approach." Sarah, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. "I don't think it's just about Buddy. He's special, yes, but I believe many animals have this sensitivity. We need to establish a network of monitoring stations, each with animals that have demonstrated sensitivity to pre-seismic indicators, and we need to correlate their behavior with our existing sensor networks to understand exactly what they're detecting." She paused, aware that she was proposing a major expansion of what had started as a small, almost personal project. "It won't be easy. There will be variables we can't control: false alarms, missed events. But today proved the concept is valid. And with proper research and development, we could create a system that gives people precious minutes of warning before a major earthquake. Enough time to get to safety, to shut down critical systems, to prepare emergency services." The room was silent for a moment as everyone considered the implications. Then Marcus nodded. "I agree. This is too important to ignore, regardless of how unconventional it might seem to some in the scientific community. The city will back you." Jake added, looking directly at Sarah. "And I suspect once word gets out about what happened today, you'll have support from other sources as well." The meeting continued for another hour as they hammered out a preliminary plan for the expanded research program. When it finally concluded, most of the team dispersed to continue their various tasks related to the earthquake response. But Sarah, Jake, and Buddy remained in the conference room. Jake was the first to break the silence between them. "You did something extraordinary today, Sarah." She shook her head. "Buddy did. I just had the sense to pay attention." "Don't undersell yourself," Jake insisted. "A lot of people would have dismissed what they were seeing, or kept it to themselves for fear of ridicule. You had the courage to follow the evidence, even when it led in an unexpected direction. And you had the conviction to sound the alarm, even knowing you might be wrong." Sarah felt a warmth spread through her at his words. It had been a long time since she had allowed herself to feel pride in her work, to believe that what she was doing mattered in a concrete, immediate way. The past 2 years had been filled with grief and guilt, with the constant, nagging question of whether she could have done more to save her family. "I've been hiding," she admitted, voicing the thought aloud for the first time. "After I lost David and Emma, I couldn't bear to face the world. I buried myself in research, in data, in the cold comfort of scientific certainty. But Buddy," she looked down at the golden retriever, who was watching her with those soulful amber eyes. "Buddy pulled me back to the world of the living. He needed me, and in needing me, he gave me purpose again." Jake reached across the table and took her hand, a gesture so gentle and unexpected that Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes. "I've missed you," he said simply. Sarah didn't pull her hand away. Instead, she squeezed his fingers, allowing herself to feel the connection, the warmth of human contact that she had denied herself for too long. "I've missed me too," she replied, a small smile finding its way to her lips. Outside the conference room windows, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the campus. It had been a day of destruction, but also of triumph, of lives saved rather than lost. And for Sarah, it had been something more, a step toward healing, toward reclaiming the life she had thought was forever lost. Buddy, sensing the shift in her mood, sat up and rested his head on her knee, his tail thumping gently against the floor. Sarah stroked his golden head, feeling a surge of affection for this creature who had changed everything. "What do you say we get out of here for a while?" Jake suggested. "Get some fresh air, maybe some food. I think we've earned a break." Sarah hesitated, her old instinct to retreat, to isolate herself in work, briefly surfacing. But then she looked at Buddy, at Jake, and made a choice. "I'd like that," she said, and meant it. As they left the lab, walking side by side with Buddy trotting happily between them, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time: the simple joy of being alive, of moving forward rather than standing still. The earthquake had shaken more than just the ground beneath her feet. It had shaken her loose from the paralysis of grief, reminding her that even in loss, there was still life to be lived. And she was finally, cautiously, ready to embrace it. The weeks following the earthquake were a whirlwind of activity. The city's recovery efforts were well underway, with damaged infrastructure being repaired and affected communities receiving support. But the most significant development, from Sarah's perspective, was the explosion of interest in Project Buddy. What had begun as a small, quasi-experimental project had suddenly become the focus of intense scientific and public attention. News of how Buddy had provided advanced warning of the earthquake had spread rapidly, first locally, then nationally, and finally internationally. Sarah found herself inundated with interview requests, offers of research funding, and inquiries from other seismologists interested in collaborating. The university had quickly recognized the potential importance of the research and had allocated additional resources, including a dedicated laboratory space and research staff. The city had also come through with funding, as Jake had promised, and several private foundations had expressed interest in supporting the expanded program. Sarah was both exhilarated and overwhelmed by the sudden spotlight. She had spent years working in relative obscurity, focusing on the minutiae of seismic data analysis. Now she was being hailed as a pioneer, her unconventional approach vindicated by the lives it had saved. But with recognition came responsibility. Sarah was determined that the research move forward with scientific rigor, avoiding the sensationalism that sometimes surrounded animal behavior studies. She insisted on double-blind protocols, controlled environments, and extensive data collection to ensure that their findings would stand up to scrutiny. Working closely with Dr. Rodriguez and a team of animal behaviorists, Sarah had begun to develop a standardized method for identifying and training animals with sensitivity to pre-seismic indicators. They had already recruited several dogs with promising abilities, as well as a few cats and, surprisingly, a pair of rabbits that had shown consistent reactions before minor tremors. Each animal was placed in a comfortable but monitored environment, their behavior tracked continuously and correlated with seismic data. Slowly but surely, patterns were emerging, confirming what Sarah had first observed with Buddy. Certain animals seemed capable of detecting subtle precursors to seismic events, often minutes or even hours before human instruments could detect anything unusual. Jake had become a regular presence in Sarah's life, both professionally and personally. As the city's emergency management director, he was keenly interested in developing practical applications for the research. But there was more to his frequent visits than professional interest, and Sarah found herself increasingly looking forward to seeing him. They had fallen into a comfortable routine of shared meals, long walks with Buddy, and evenings spent talking about everything and nothing. It wasn't quite dating. They were both still finding their way back to each other. But it was a beginning, a tentative exploration of what might be possible. One evening, about 2 months after the earthquake, Sarah was working late in the new Project Buddy laboratory. The space was impressive, with separate monitoring areas for each animal, state-of-the-art seismic equipment, and a sophisticated data analysis center. But tonight, it was quiet, with most of the staff having gone home hours ago. Sarah was reviewing data from the newest addition to their animal team, a border collie named Luna who had shown remarkable sensitivity during a recent series of minor tremors. When she heard the lab door open, looking up, she saw Jake, carrying what appeared to be takeout containers. "I thought you might be hungry," he said, holding up the bags. "You missed our dinner." Sarah glanced at the clock and realized with a start that it was past 9 p.m. They had planned to meet at a new restaurant at 7. "Oh, Jake, I'm so sorry," she said, running a hand through her hair. "I got caught up in the data analysis and completely lost track of time." Instead of being annoyed, Jake just smiled. "I figured as much, so I brought the restaurant to you." He set the bags down on a clear space at the end of her desk and began unpacking containers of fragrant Thai food. Sarah felt a rush of affection for this man who understood her so well, who didn't take offense at her occasional absent-mindedness, who supported her work without trying to change her. "You're too good to me," she said, closing her laptop and moving to help him. "Nah," Jake replied with a grin. "I just know what it's like to get absorbed in your work. And besides," he gestured around the lab, "what you're doing here is important. It's worth a few missed dinner reservations." They sat together, eating pad thai and green curry, talking about the day's developments. Jake shared news of the city's recovery efforts, which were proceeding faster than expected thanks in part to the advanced warning they'd had before the earthquake. Sarah told him about Luna's promising results and her plans for expanding the animal monitoring network. The challenge now, she explained between bites, is to identify exactly what these animals are sensing. Is it the P waves that arrive before the more destructive S waves? Changes in the Earth's magnetic field, release of gases from fracturing rock. If we can pinpoint the specific precursors they're detecting, we might be able to develop more sensitive instruments tuned to those same indicators. Jake nodded, considering. So even if we can't have a Buddy or a Luna everywhere, we could have sensors designed to detect what they're detecting. Exactly, Sarah confirmed, pleased that he grasped the concept so quickly. The animals are showing us what to look for. They're like biological prototypes for the next generation of early warning systems. They continued talking, the conversation flowing easily from work to more personal topics. Jake shared stories of his childhood in Oregon, where his family had a small farm. Sarah found herself telling him about her early fascination with earthquakes, sparked by a minor tremor she had experienced as a child in Southern California. It was comfortable, this back and forth between them, a rediscovery of the connection they had once shared, deepened now by all they had been through. Sarah realized with a sense of surprise that she was happy, not just content or distracted from grief, but genuinely happy in this moment with this man, with the work she was doing. As if reading her thoughts, Jake reached across the table and took her hand. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice soft but steady, "about us. About what happened 2 years ago and what's happening now." Sarah felt a flutter of anxiety, but she didn't pull away. "What about us?" Jake's eyes, warm and serious, held hers. "I want to try again, Sarah. Not as if nothing happened. I know too much has changed for that, but something new, something that honors the past while moving forward." The words hung between them, a question and an offer rolled into one. Sarah felt the weight of it, the potential for joy and, yes, for pain. 2 years ago, she had run from that potential, unable to bear the thought of loving and losing again. But now, with Buddy sleeping peacefully in the corner of the lab, with the knowledge of lives saved through their work together, she found that the fear no longer held the same power over her. "I'd like that," she said finally, her voice quiet but sure. "To try again." Jakey's smile was like sunrise, slow and warm and full of promise. He leaned forward, and Sarah met him halfway, their lips meeting in a kiss that felt both familiar and new, an echo of what had been and a glimpse of what could be. When they parted, Sarah was smiling too, a genuine, unguarded smile that reached her eyes. It felt strange, almost forgotten, this simple expression of joy. But good too, right? The moment was interrupted by a soft whine from the corner of the lab. Sarah turned to see Buddy, no longer sleeping but sitting upright, his ears perked forward and his body tense with alertness. "Buddy," she called, immediately on guard. She had learned to trust the dog's instincts, to pay attention to his signals. "What is it, boy?" Jake was already on his feet, his emergency management training kicking in automatically. "I see sensing something." Sarah moved quickly to her computer, pulling up the real-time seismic monitoring data. No unusual activity showing yet, but she checked the time, 9:47 p.m. "I'm logging his behavior now. Let's see if anything develops." They watched as Buddy's anxiety escalated, following the pattern they had documented many times now: the initial alertness, the whining, the pacing, the seeking of human proximity. Sarah recorded each phase meticulously, while also checking all available seismic data. At 9:52 p.m., exactly 5 minutes after Buddy's initial reaction, the first subtle tremor registered on the lab's sensitive instruments. A small event, likely unnoticeable to most people. "There it is," Sarah said, pointing to the readout. "Magnitude 2.7, about 20 miles from here." Buddy sensed it 5 minutes before our instruments detected anything. Jake moved to stand beside her, studying the data over her shoulder. Is this a precursor to something bigger, like last time? Sarah was already analyzing the tremor's characteristics, comparing them to the patterns they had observed before the 6.2 earthquake. "I don't think so," she said after a moment. "The location is different, and the signature doesn't match the precursory tremors we saw in April. This looks more like a typical minor event, not part of a larger stress migration pattern." As she spoke, Buddy's anxiety began to subside. He stopped pacing and settled back down, his body language relaxing. It was another pattern they had observed. The animal's level of distress seemed proportional to the magnitude and proximity of the impending event. A small, distant tremor like this one caused only mild, brief anxiety. "I think we're safe," Sarah concluded, still monitoring the data. "But I'll keep tracking for the next hour to be sure." Jake nodded, his own tension easing. Then he chuckled. "Well, that's one way to interrupt a moment." Sarah smiled, turning away from the computer to face him. "Welcome to my world. Seismic activity waits for no one, not even romantic declarations." "I wouldn't have it any other way," Jake replied, his eyes warm with affection. "This work is part of who you are, Sarah. And I love who you are." The word, love, hung in the air between them, neither expected nor unwelcome. Sarah felt it settle around her like a comfortable blanket, warming places within her that had been cold for too long. "I'm not the same person I was before," she said softly, needing him to understand. "I'll never be that person again. The earthquake, losing David and Emma, it changed me." Jake nodded, his expression serious. "I know, and I'm not asking you to be who you were. I'm here for who you are now and who you're becoming. All of it." Sarah stepped closer to him, feeling a certainty she hadn't experienced in years. "Then I think we have a lot to look forward to." As if in agreement, Buddy trotted over and nudged his head between them, his tail wagging gently. "All three of us," Sarah amended, laughing as she crouched down to ruffle the golden retriever's fur. "After all, none of this would be happening without you, would it, boy?" In that moment, surrounded by the tools of her research and the beings she was coming to love, Sarah felt the full circle of her journey. From devastation to discovery, from isolation to connection, from loss to a new kind of wholeness. The earth would continue to shake, to remind them of its power and unpredictability. But they would face it together, using the unique bond between humans and animals to create something remarkable, a chance to be prepared, to be safe, to save lives. And for Sarah, that was more than enough. It was everything. The 6-month anniversary of the April earthquake brought with it a series of milestone events. The city held a memorial service for those who had lost their lives, combined with a celebration of the innovative early warning system that had saved countless others. Project Buddy, as it was still affectionately known despite its official title of Biologically Enhanced Seismic Precursor Detection Program, was featured prominently in these commemorations. Sarah found herself addressing a gathering of city officials, scientists, and community members on the steps of City Hall, with Buddy sitting proudly beside her. Jake stood just behind them, a supportive presence as Sarah described the progress they had made and the lives that had been saved. What began as one dog's unusual behavior has evolved into a comprehensive research program that is changing how we approach earthquake prediction. She told the assembled crowd, "We now have a network of 27 specially selected and trained animals across the Bay Area, each continuously monitored and linked to our central analysis system. In the past 6 months, this network has successfully provided advanced warning for 8 seismic events, giving emergency services and residents valuable time to prepare." The crowd applauded, and Sarah felt a surge of pride. The project had exceeded even her most optimistic expectations, attracting international attention and funding that had allowed for rapid expansion. Research teams in Japan, Mexico, and Italy had begun implementing similar programs, adapting the protocols Sarah and her team had developed to their own seismically active regions. "But we're not stopping here," Sarah continued. "Our research has identified specific biosignatures, patterns of behavior that consistently precede seismic events of different magnitudes. These signatures are helping us develop the next generation of early warning technology, sensors that mimic the sensitivity of our animal partners." She gestured to a display behind her, which showed a prototype of a new seismic detection device. "These sensors, which we've developed in collaboration with the university's engineering department, are designed to detect the same subtle precursors that animals like Buddy respond to. The goal is to create a hybrid warning system that combines the innate sensitivity of animals with the reliability and scalability of technology." More applause followed, and Sarah couldn't help but smile. 2 years ago, she had been lost in grief, going through the motions of her research without truly engaging with the world around her. Now she was standing in the sunshine, addressing a crowd, with a renewed sense of purpose and connection. After the ceremony, there was a reception in the City Hall rotunda. Sarah moved through the crowd, Buddy at her side, accepting congratulations and answering questions about the project. Jake was never far away, sometimes joining the conversations, sometimes hanging back, but always a supportive presence. As the event was winding down, Dr. Maya Rodriguez approached, beaming with pride. The veterinarian had become an integral part of the Project Buddy team, overseeing the health and welfare of the animal participants and contributing valuable insights from her expertise in animal behavior. "You were wonderful out there," Maya said, giving Sarah a quick hug, "and Project Buddy has come such a long way. When you first came to my office with this idea, I thought it had potential, but I never imagined it would grow into something this significant." Sarah smiled, remembering that first meeting. "I had no idea either. I was just following a hunch, trying to make sense of Buddy's behavior. The best science often starts that way," Maya observed, "with curiosity and observation, rather than preconceived theories. You were open to what Buddy was showing you, even when it didn't fit neatly into established paradigms. That's rare in scientists." Before Sarah could respond, Marcus Chen joined them, looking pleased. The deputy director of the seismological laboratory had been one of the project's earliest supporters, taking a professional risk by endorsing such an unconventional approach. "I just got word," he announced with a grin. "The National Science Foundation has approved our grant proposal. $5 million over 3 years to expand the research and develop the biomimetic sensors." Sarah felt a rush of excitement. This was the validation they had been hoping for. Recognition from one of the most prestigious scientific funding bodies in the country. "That's incredible news, Marcus!" "Thank you for all your work on the proposal." "Don't thank me," Marcus replied. "This is your vision. I just helped with the paperwork." The conversation continued, with plans being made for how to use the new funding, which regions to target for the next phase of the animal network, and how to refine the prototype sensors. Sarah felt a deep satisfaction in discussing these practical details, in seeing her initial insight developing into a mature research program with real-world impact. Later, as the reception was coming to an end, Sarah found herself standing with Jake near one of the rotunda's tall windows, looking out at the city spread below them. The setting sun cast a golden glow over the buildings, the bay shimmering in the distance. "Quite a view," Jake commented, his shoulder brushing against hers. "It is," Sarah agreed, taking in the panorama of the city she had called home for over a decade. A city that had seen her greatest joys and deepest sorrows, that had nearly broken her, and yet had also been the site of her redemption. "I was thinking," Jake said after a moment, his voice casual in a way that immediately made Sarah suspicious. "With all the attention the project is getting, and the new funding coming in, you're going to need a more permanent base of operations." Sarah turned to look at him, curious where this was going. "Yes, we've been discussing options with the university. Possibly a dedicated facility on campus, or renovating part of the existing seismology building." Jake nodded, seeming slightly nervous now. "That makes sense. But I had another thought. What if we looked for a place together? Something with enough space for the project's administrative operations, and also, for us?" Sarah blinked, surprised by the suggestion. "You mean live together, and work together, to some extent?" Jake clarified quickly. "I know how important it is for you to have your research space, and I thought maybe we could find something that would accommodate that. A house with a separate office or studio, maybe. Somewhere Buddy would have room to run, somewhere that could feel like home." The word home caught in Sarah's chest. She had an apartment, a place to sleep and store her belongings, but she hadn't had a true home since the earthquake that took her family. The thought of creating one, with Jake and Buddy, was both terrifying and exhilarating. But as she looked at Jake's hopeful expression, at Buddy sitting contentedly at their feet, Sarah felt the fear recede. In its place was a quiet certainty, a knowledge that this step forward was right, was necessary, was wanted. "Yes," she said simply. "I'd like that." Jake's face broke into a wide smile, his relief and joy evident. He leaned in and kissed her softly, there in the fading light of the rotunda, with Buddy watching approvingly from below. When they parted, Sarah felt a sense of completion, of a circle closing. The earth would continue to shake, to reshape itself in violent, unpredictable ways. But she had found solid ground again, a foundation built not on the absence of risk but on the presence of love, purpose, and connection. And with Buddy, their remarkable canine companion who had started it all, they would continue the work of understanding these powerful forces, of providing warnings that saved lives, of turning scientific curiosity into practical hope. As they left City Hall, walking hand in hand with Buddy trotting happily beside them, Sarah looked up at the evening sky, streaked with pink and gold. The future stretched before them, uncertain as always, but full of possibilities she was finally ready to embrace. The earth might tremble, but they would stand firm, together.